Greetings, welcome to the Godless Spell Checker podcast. I'm Stephen Knight. Hope you're all doing well. An excellent guest and quite a large topic to cover on today's podcast. I'll be speaking to Ella Hill. Ella Hill is actually a pseudonym for very understandable reasons. Ella has to protect her identity because Ella was a victim of the Rotherham child sexual exploitation scandal. Many of you who are frequent listeners to this podcast or follow my output on Twitter would have seen the endless articles and reports I've shared on this and some of the commentary I've provided. I know me and Iram have covered it a fair number of times on Taking the Myth, but just to refresh your memory, Rotherham, for those not aware, is a town in South Yorkshire, that's the north of England, and from around the late 80s to 2010s, something like 1,400 girls were victims of child rapists. Now, what set these cases apart, what makes it something especially of note, is the fact that the victims were almost exclusively white and girls. Many of them were underage, below the legal age of consent. And the perpetrators were overwhelmingly Muslim men of Pakistani extract. There were exceptions, obviously, but the statistics on this is alarming, and the scale of it I don't think is still fully understood. I mean, just in this one area, like I said, it's an estimated 1,400 victims, and it's difficult to fit a statistic like that in your head. If you meditate on that fact too long, I think it might drive you mad. And I know I've spoken about this topic a lot on the podcast. It's come up on my Twitter feed. It's something that I'm interested in and I care about. Strangely enough, it's never occurred to me to speak to somebody who was a victim of this. And I suppose the main reason would be a lot of these young girls are not out in the open, they're not public, they value their anonymity, and you can't really blame them for not being public speakers, obviously. And the second reason is it's just, I don't want to feel like I'm being exploitative to bring somebody on and ask them about their experiences. What I really valued in having Ella on the show is she actually reached out to me. She wanted to speak on my platform and share her story and advocate the ideas and solutions she has. And I'm very grateful she has, because she's very well spoken, very eloquent, very level-headed. She's really experienced some of the worst of what this entire scandal has to offer. So it's quite a courageous thing to speak about that publicly. So I suppose a slight warning up front. You know, I'm not one for trigger warnings, but this podcast will touch on real cases of psychological and physical abuse of the extreme kind, of a sexual nature as well. So you're all adults. I know you can handle this. If some of you feel you can't, that's fine too, but fair warning, if you usually play this in the kitchen while washing the dishes while your kids are around, probably not recommended. But I'm very grateful for Ella for speaking so courageously and candidly about her experience and engaging in a really interesting way with it too. So if you've enjoyed hearing from her, please send her a few kind words on Twitter. One of the things I love about my audience is that when you enjoy an episode of the podcast, you take a couple of minutes out just to let my guests know you're grateful for their story, their time, the information and entertainment they often bring to the show. You always take a moment just to say thank you. And I can honestly say that means the world to people who come on and share their expertise and their story. It really does matter when somebody says something nice to them. So you can find Ella on Twitter at Ella Hill UK. I shall put some links to her social media page on Twitter, and in the show notes you'll find some links to her articles in The Independent, which are well worth a read. And I think that's about it. So without further ado, enjoy. I'm very pleased to welcome Ella Hill to the GS podcast. Ella, how are you doing?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you, Stephen?
Yes, good, delightful.
Great.
Yeah, life's good. Let's just leave it there, really, shouldn't we?
Yeah.
100%. I've been really looking forward to recording an episode for you. We had a brief chat the other night, just went over a few things that we think might be of interest to speak about. So maybe you could just take a moment to explain who you are and why you have an important story.
Yeah. Well, I use a pseudonym, so my real name isn't Ella Hill, but I'm a Rotherham grooming gang survivor. I'm a mum, and yeah, I've written a few things for The Independent, and I'm trying to raise awareness about the racist and religious aspects of grooming gang crime.
Yeah, that's quite fascinating. I mean, somebody like me who's fairly critical of religion, I say fairly critical, overtly critical in general, or religious fundamentalism, should I say. One of the things that I've honed in on really is the racial aspect and the religious motivation for a lot of these grooming gangs. I mean, it's come up in court, it's also a cultural thing, but I don't think it gets as much attention in mainstream circles, if any at all. So, I mean, maybe we could start just to talk about what was the Rotherham grooming scandal? What does that mean to my listeners who might not be aware, or listeners who aren't based in the UK?
Yeah, well, it's the biggest sex scandal of the UK, and the news broke in 2014 with an Alexis J report on the huge numbers of white girls that were being, mainly white girls, that were being groomed through having relationships with predominantly Pakistani male men, older men who would later use violence and threats and intimidation to traffic them, rape them, gang rape them, and sell them for sex. So my experience happened about 20 years ago, and I talk about it now because although, I moved on in my life, when the news came out in 2014, that was when I became aware of how big the problem was in Rotherham and what I'd escaped and what I got away from. And at that point, I made a complaint to the IPCC, the Independent Police Complaints Commission, because I felt that it was necessary to get some changes, given the severity of a lot of the crimes that were being committed and the ineptitude of the police to deal with it on such a massive scale, and not just in Rotherham, but up and down Britain, up and down the country, in lots and lots of different towns and cities. So that's how I started to get back involved in it again, and since then I've re-reported the crimes against me, and that's been reinvestigated by Rotherham Police.
So that's currently ongoing and open as we speak?
No, they investigated that for a year and dropped the case. Again, it was dreadful experience, very poor service, if you would call it that, from the police. And yeah, so I'm going through a second complaint against the police forces again now, with a view to hopefully having different senior officers losing their jobs through gross misconduct.
Okay, well maybe we'll circle back around on the systemic issues which were well documented in a lot of the reports that came out about this scandal. But in terms of the word grooming, it's kind of it seems almost very euphemistic and not particularly helpful. And I was just wondering if you could explain what that process is of grooming.
Well, grooming, it's a sociological term for a psychological process of training someone to become into the position where they're being exploited for whatever reason, but in this case it's for sexual reasons. So it can be used to explain lots of different psychological processes, but in the case of grooming gangs, which is the accepted vernacular for racially and religiously aggravated rapes, in grooming gangs, what typically happens is that you're approached by an older man He befriends you. He gives you compliments, says nice things, offers to take you out for a meal, gets you drinks or food, and then gives you gifts and presents and gets your phone number, finds out where you live. And it may start off really friendly and like pally and kind of nice to start with, but then it goes on to an abusive relationship stage, and then in some cases trafficking or being sold for sex.
Right. I mean, I think I've already said to you before when we spoke that I want you to be entirely comfortable on this podcast and only talk about what you want to talk about. So there's no version of me that's going to push for anything.
Yeah, you said that. That's fine. If there's anything that you ask that I can't answer, I'll just say I can't answer that.
Perfect. So how old was you when this all started happening?
I can't answer that.
You can't answer straight into one you can't answer.
I can't give really specific details, like exactly, because it would
make you identifiable.
Too much to say exactly who I am, and I need some anonymity.
But under the age of consent, would that be fair?
But no, I was over the age of consent. I was in my late teens. My perpetrator was in his 30s, so he was about 15 years older.
So a fair power dynamic shift there.
Yeah, it was like an adult-child relationship, really, rather than... although an adult-teenager relationship rather than a proper boyfriend-girlfriend relationship.
Yeah, and you'll often hear as well when they profile these predators, they'll often go for people perceived to be vulnerable or people who have come from a broken home. And I was just wondering how much of that profile would you say mapped onto you, or were you an exception in that sense?
There is definitely that profile, because there are a lot of girls who have been in care and they haven't had that family support or backup to perhaps get them out at the right time when things started to become dangerous or worrying. But in my case, I had a very loving family. I came from a middle-class family, 2 cars and a mortgage kind of household. I didn't really have any particular vulnerabilities. There's no drug or alcohol use in my family. I just say like I'm an average British person.
Right.
Yeah, and there's a lot of us as well. I've met other survivors who are from similar backgrounds. We're not all from children's homes at all. It's quite a mixture.
Did your family notice anything suspicious or untoward in any of these stages? Was there any attempts at trying to raise an alarm with what was happening to you?
Yes, my mum was worried, and probably my dad as well, but they didn't want to be racist, so they felt they couldn't say anything.
Right, because I do hear that raised a lot, and I think it was referenced in a number of the reports as well, but it sometimes gets a little bit dismissed. But this idea of, I mean, it's incredible to think of, really, and I hope this is one of these things people will look back at and just know that's absurd once we've got a bit of distance from it. But our culture in Britain was so anti-racist to the point where I think it had overcompensated, and just the mere accusation of racism was enough to destroy reputations, livelihoods, etc. So, it seems absurd to say that the exploitation of minors and yourself couldn't be challenged because of fears of racism, but that's a very real thing that's been created in society, isn't it?
Yes, and it's probably still is like that for a lot of people. Afraid to be called racist. But initially I was really pleased with, this new man that I met, and I thought he was really charming and really good looking, and he seemed to have all the trappings of a nice lifestyle, nice car, nice home, and seemed to be successful, although later on I realised he wasn't at all. He was not what he appeared, let's put it that way. So, yeah, it's a trap that you fall into, and these are con men. These men who go out to do this, they're doing it with lots of girls. I mean, I've been told by the police that there were lots of girls that he was doing this with.
Is your situation involving one individual, or was it several individuals?
There were initially one, so he became my boyfriend, and it was just a one-to-one relationship initially, and then after a few months, it became very violent, very controlling, very religious. I'll go into that whole religious ideology in a minute. And taking me to different houses to be gang raped as punishment for sins, alleged sins.
Right.
So there were lots of other people involved. And then after a year, when I tried to escape, I tried to get away and moved away, he tracked me down, and I can't give all the details because it would be too much information, but they planned an honour attack, and they told me that they were going to carry out this kidnapping and gang rape and honour attack, and they did, and I was left unconscious in a pool of blood with lots of fractures and lacerations, and I was in hospital for a week. And at that point, my parents, the police told my parents to move me away, change my name and move me away. That's what they did. And I went on to university. I started a new life with a new identity, and put it all behind me and forgot about it. I made a really good recovery. Even though I didn't have any counselling, I just pulled myself together and just got on with my life. I had ambitions and things that I wanted to do. So I went to university, got a good degree, got married, had kids, did all the things that I initially planned with my life, really.
Yeah, that's incredibly positive, really, isn't it? I think, how did you describe it when we spoke the night from Survivor to Thriver?
Yeah.
Which I really love.
That's what I call it, yeah.
Okay.
So I would see myself as a thriver, definitely. Although, I've met a lot of survivors who, are at the position that I was in maybe in 2014 when I had the shell shock of the revelation of understanding what had happened and learning more about it, and, reading about this type of exploitation and that, the shock of that, and meeting lots of survivors, going to survivor groups.
Yeah, this kind of thing, understandably, can and does destroy lives forever, doesn't it? And
whole families, whole families can be torn apart by it because it is horrible. It's absolutely devastating. It's so upsetting.
When you were a victim of this attempted kidnap and what sounds like a very vicious assault, were the police notified at that point, or was this something you just kept quiet? How did that work?
The police knew about it. They knew about it before and after. They knew that it was planned before, and they knew that it happened afterwards.
Were there any reports taken? Did they follow it up?
Yeah, they were. And the investigation into that found gross misconduct of the police.
Right.
They should have taken it. They should have pressed charges because they had all the evidence there. But they did arrest my perpetrators, and two of my perpetrators.
Right, okay. That's something.
Several times, actually. They've done that several times before.
They're not entirely useless then? Close.
Well...
Well,
no comment.
Talk to me a little bit about the religious aspect, because I'm reading your work in The Independent, the couple of articles that I've read from you there, very clear and concise, but I was very surprised to see you acknowledge the religious angle as openly as you did, because that doesn't get spoken about enough, but it is there when you're reading in between the lines and reading, and if you know anything about overtly conservative Islamic culture or extremely conservative Pakistani culture as well, that it doesn't seem surprising. So maybe you can tell us a little bit, if you're comfortable, with the ways in which that manifested.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I have to say this isn't all Muslims.
Yep.
I have to say it's in every faith and belief that you can get religious abuse and spiritual abuse. That occurs everywhere. The use of scriptures as tools of control, the use of guilt and shaming to manipulate and enforce certain rules and behaviours. And so those sorts of things are common to lots and lots of faiths. And so that's why I call it religious abuse, is what this is, rather than Islam. Why
do you think there isn't a whole host of Christian grooming gang scandals up and down the UK, given the numbers, the demographics?
There's a specific us and them mentality within these grooming gangs, which is that Muslims are good, Muslims are pure, Muslim women cover themselves, they keep themselves virgins till marriage, they are sort of the ones that we hold up on a pedestal. And white girls are the opposite to that. They're evil, they're slags, they're whores.
So not only
the lowest to the low.
A religious aspect to it in terms of, women as property and reinforcing this idea of purity, but there's a huge racial aspect to it as well.
Yes, it's racism against whites or against non-Muslims. Well, not that that's exactly a race, but it's racism against the West. Looking from Pakistan, because a lot of these men, in their mind, they are living their lives in Pakistan, even though they're living in the UK, so much of their thoughts are about Pakistan and about Kashmir, about their hometowns, that they're looking at the UK, they're looking at Europe, the West, from a Pakistani perspective.
Were the perpetrators in your case, were they British born or?
Some were and some weren't.
Right.
Yeah. So, yeah, definitely some came over here from Pakistan. Yeah. So they had a lot of the traditional beliefs of different, of specific groups within Pakistan. Not every group thinks the same. So shall I talk you through some of the things that were taught to me?
Yeah, absolutely.
Some of the religious aspects that were taught to me.
Yeah, feel free, please do.
Okay. So I've got my piece of paper to remind me here. So the first one is purity. So first of all, very first thing you're told, you're my girlfriend now, you're not allowed to eat pork at all. Whether you're with me, whether you're away from me, you're not allowed to eat pork, because pork is forbidden.
So it's not just like, it's not a consideration of please don't eat pork around me because I have an aversion to it. It's don't eat pork at all, no matter where you are. It's now, haram.
Because in our community we don't eat pork. That makes you polluted. That makes you dirty. That's an Islamic thing to do. So you can't have pork. White girls have no shame and no honour because you're not covered. You're not, you're drinking. Although I didn't personally drink, but white girls drink and they listen to music and dance and all the things that are forbidden. So that's dishonourable. White girls are all slags. They all sleep with hundreds of men. And when I asked about how did you think that, why do you think that, and they said, well, our mothers taught us this. Our mothers told us we have to stay away from you. If you offend our religion or our honour, we'll kill you. You're a white slag, you're a white whore, you're a white cunt, you're a fucking gory. So am I allowed to swear on this podcast?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, it's positively encouraged. So feel
great,
free.
Lovely.
But just explain what the term gory means to those who may not have heard it.
It's the Pakistani word for white girl.
Yeah.
Or white person. Yeah. So, with every time that I was being beaten, every time that I was being raped, it was, you're a fucking slag, you're a fucking white whore, you're a fucking gory. It's all racial slurs over and over and over, hours and hours. Very focused on the fact that you're white. Virginity. So they would say in my culture, we're not allowed to have sex with you until you've started your periods, which is about age 11 on average in the UK. But they said we are allowed to do thigh-ing with you before that, which they did to me. It's a permitted way to molest children who are too young to have sex with. It's written in the scriptures. It's written as a permitted way to have sex with children.
Oh, I mean, I'm hearing a lot of this there's a racial component to it. It's an anti-non-Muslim thing, and I suppose this would have occurred in a time before the Equalities Act and hate crime legislation and things like that. And I'd imagine it doesn't get characterised as any of those things when people talk about it, or when convictions are made. I don't think they probably would class it as racially motivated. No,
the problem is the IPCC told me this when they came to interview me. I was telling them this is racist, these are racist slurs, and they said, well, we're not allowed to put anything about race or religion in our reports. So we're stripping your evidence of any reference to race or religion.
Was that an official policy, or was this something decided?
It's an official policy within the police investigations unit, and it's an official policy within the police that they strip your evidence of any reference to race or religion, which when you're trying to then prove in court that it's a racially and religiously aggravated crime,
puts you at a severe disadvantage.
Puts you at a severe disadvantage, yeah.
Is that still current policy?
I will have to check with the IPC, because they changed their name from IPCC, so it's a bit confusing. But 2 or 3 years ago, that was their policy, to not have any reference to race or religion in any of their reports, which I argued with them. And I said, if it was the other way around, if it was a racially aggravated attack by a white person on a Muslim woman, a white man on a Muslim woman, that would be included in the report, because you would say that's a racist attack. So why aren't you doing it this way around?
I mean, how long did this go on for? I don't know if you can give me a time frame in terms of years or months or however long it lasted, but how long were you a victim of this cycle?
Over a year, about 18 months.
About 18 months. And at what point did you manage to start thinking that you need to emancipate yourself from this situation, and how did you achieve that?
Well, after like 2 or 3 months, I wanted to get out, because I'd been in love with my perpetrator, but he beat that out of me. So I literally had no feelings for him. I wanted to get out, I wanted to escape, but the threats to my life, the threats to my parents' life, scared me into not getting away.
Are any of these threats made to your family or friends directly, or is this a threat that was always made to you?
It was, if your parents try and stop me from seeing you, then I'll kill them. Or if they try and stop me from seeing you, or you from seeing me, then I will kill them.
That's incredibly manipulative, because obviously we have the physical and emotional abuse that you're experiencing yourself as an individual.
Yeah.
But then when your loved ones are then leveraged on top of that, it makes the entire thing a million times more complicated for anyone.
Intense. I mean, there's guns and knives. I was being intimidated with guns. I was being taken to shooting ranges to watch them shoot, so that I could see how good they were at shooting. I was being threatened with knives to cut off body parts. I was being tortured, regularly tortured, quite severe, and sleep deprived. So you'd be beaten through the night, and then you'd sleep on the floor, because the man has to go on the bed because he has to be higher than the woman. So you sleep on the floor, and then just in the middle of the night, you'd be woken up being kicked over and over and over, and then they strip you and rape you again, stamp on your head, strangle you, suffocate you till you're nearly unconscious. Really violent things. I won't go into too much detail with the torture, because it's quite disgusting and it's disturbing for me and everyone else, but it's extreme torture. Really, really, really bad.
Yeah, I can't
so
imagine.
I was going to talk a little bit more about the grooming gang ideology.
Sure.
You okay?
Absolutely, I'm good.
So yeah, I'll tell you a bit about modesty. So modesty is a really big part of the us and them mentality.
Yeah.
So there are religious scriptures that were quoted to me, like, if one of your wives disobeys you, then beat her. And I would argue, I'm not one of your wives, I haven't disobeyed you. But they would say, this scripture, and we are allowed to do this to you as long as we don't enjoy it, because that's what the Quran says. And you must be covered down to your ankles, down to your wrists, and the hem of the top must be down to your knees. So if you've got tight clothes on, you're showing the curves of your body, or if you've got a gap between your thighs.
So they actually dictated what you wore as well?
Yes. Yeah.
So it's this complete and utter total control, isn't it, from every single aspect?
Yeah, and this is what happens in high control religious groups. It's control of... There's a bite model, the Steve Hassan bite model, which is control of behaviour, information, thought and emotions. So there's different ways that high control religious groups will literally control every area of your life: what you eat, what you wear, what time you get up, what time you go to sleep, what you're allowed to listen to, what you're allowed to think, what your emotions are allowed to be. So it's very tight control, and they've been brought up with this themselves. I make the point of saying, it's not something that they just invent out of nowhere. It's their lifestyle that they are brought up with. These men are under very high control. They're beaten. They are indoctrinated religiously.
I mean, what's really interesting about the pattern of behaviour from these gangs is it's not one localised cult that sort of lives on a farm somewhere, and they've all come to this understanding of the world, and they all behave in accordance with that. These are pockets of men from north to south of the entire, island who behave in exactly the same manner, who seemingly have no communication with each other, but the thing they all have in common is obviously an adherence to Islam and predominantly sort of Pakistani heritage as well. So, I mean, we have to really acknowledge and address the cultural and religious aspects. I mean, it's the only common denominator, really, isn't it?
Well, there is a large network throughout the country, and these families are all interconnected.
Right.
So it's not just one little isolated gang in one town, another little isolated gang in another town. There's a lot of driving back and forth and interconnections. And I don't know where it originally started in the UK, but I imagine it probably started at one point and then just spread from connections to these ideas are just taught and spread by word of mouth from one person to the next, one cousin to another cousin, brother to another brother. And that's probably how it's become the grooming gang ideology version of Islam.
Right. So yeah. So basically, these people. I mean, it hasn't just happened in isolation. Like you say, it's kind of like some sort of underground network that's slowly expanded.
And because they're trafficking, they're taking girls from one town to another town to another town, and then they're learning what to do. So then the next generation or the younger lads will pick up girls and find girls, and then they'll bring them to the older guys, and it's just gone untreated for so long that it's just been allowed to fester and fester and just get worse and worse.
How did you get out of this situation then? Because you talk about the control aspects, the physical and mental abuse, and it just seems like an impossible scenario to anyone listening, the idea that you could actually escape that kind of thing.
I'm a Christian, and I did get out of quite a few gang rape situations by using theology and by praising God. Believe it or not, I talked them out of it several times. So that's one way that I got out of it.
Would this be a form of sort of eliciting guilt around the idea of God? These incredibly godly men, this is kind of a way of showing up their hypocrisy?
I wouldn't say I did that. I just showed them that I'm not who they say I am. I'm not a slag, I'm not a whore, I'm not a cunt, I'm not kafir, I'm not an unbeliever. I worship God, I love God. So I would show them that, and then they would realise, oh, okay, we better leave her alone. So that's what saved me. That was one of the things that saved me. But as I say, in the end, I got out of it because of the honour attack. I had to leave to save my life because they were going to kill me. They tried to kill me and I survived with multiple injuries. So that's how I got out of it in the end. It was a bit dramatic.
So I suppose, I mean, I nearly said thank God you made it out there. Old habits die hard, I suppose. But so, I mean, at the time, I'm assuming, Kay, but I don't think you could have been aware of just how vast this network was, how many young white girls from your neck of the woods were affected by this.
I knew that there were other girls because the names were being spoken about to me.
Right.
Like my main perpetrator, I knew he had other white girlfriends, and I knew that when I wasn't with him, she was with him, one of the other girls was with him, and I knew he was raping his cousin's girlfriend because he told me and described what she looked like, that she had long hair down to her waist, that she was younger than me. So I sort of did know, I was aware of these other victims, but I didn't ever meet them or see them.
I mean, you this happened to you over 20 years ago, I think you said. Yeah. And but it didn't really become public knowledge, or we didn't quite. I mean, it was all. I mean, if you read the reports, it was always known about. It was always a hush thing that was spoken about. It was intentionally covered up by a number of organisations. There's systemic failings galore. But I mean, when this comes to the forefront of the public consciousness, it's reported on, it becomes front page news, and journalists and care workers do some excellent work to get the full truth out to us. I mean, what kind of effect does that have on you, that being sort of raked up and in the spotlight again?
I like it being reported in the press, as long as it's reported in a fair way, because this is something that I think has been hidden for too long. It's been a hidden crime for too long. And because of social media now, because of the way that we all are with communication, it's so much more can be talked about, the meeting of minds from all over the world, that it's just been brilliant, really, that there's been this opportunity to listen to other people's views on it and listen to people talking about it and come up with some of the solutions that we can make a difference and that we can stop things being so bad. But I think the way you described it is really good. And I think of it as like the Swiss cheese model of adverse outcomes, that if you've got a failure in this system and a failure in that system and a failure in that system, if all those holes line up, then you get adverse outcomes. So we've got failures within the schooling system, within education, failings within mosques, madrasas, failings within families, failings within social services, failings within police, failings within CPS, failings within every organisation that has equality guidelines that are unfair and that discriminate against white people and that don't prevent anti-Western hate.
I actually totally agree with you on this point. But the problem is, if you were to espouse that in the climate of sort of far left intersectional politics, which seems to dominate a lot of our discourse, you'd fast find accusations of white nationalism or white supremacy coming your way. And I imagine you already have. I've been
called that. I've been called a fascist.
Fucking hell.
Racist. Yeah. I'm like, well, what I'm against, I'm an anti-fascist and I'm an anti-racist because I'm against the racism that I've experienced and I'm against the fascism that I've experienced.
Exactly. So this experience that you have, does this not buy you any leeway with these kind of people?
Oh yeah, definitely. And when I explain it like that, and that I'm not an enemy of Islam, I'm not trying to attack Muslims, I don't advocate for any violence against Muslims or any particular sect of the Islamic faith groups, then people will listen. And even today, someone called me a gammon today on Twitter. And I sent him a few things and told him about my experiences.
It wasn't Owen Jones, was it?
No, it was Jacob, I think. Someone called Jacob. I think he's a Sufi Muslim.
Right.
He's got quite a large following, but I haven't heard of him before. So yeah, and he looked through some of the things that I was saying, some of the grooming gang ideology that I've experienced, and then he came back and said, I want to apologise because I took your comments out of context, and he just said, I give an unreserved apology for saying that, for calling you gammon.
Well, that's something.
It is, and I do find that a lot of people, like when I talk to a lot of Muslims, even if they're quite far left or they're quite Antifa linked, then they will eventually, they'll agree with me and say, yeah, these guys, these religious extremists are the dangerous guys and we need to work together against what they're doing to, come up with solutions to improve things and improve the legislation. So I've had some really positive turnarounds, really, from people who automatically assume that because I'm talking about grooming gangs that I'm far right.
Yeah.
That I hate all Muslims, and I don't at all. I've worked very hard on not hating all Muslims.
Well, let's touch on that for a moment, because I think I brought this up when we spoke the other night, because I'm very critical of Islam. I mean, I tend to go for the fundamentalist aspects of it, jihadism, conservatism, things like that. But I'm also, as like a non-believing atheist, I have no time for religion in general either. But I understand there is an endless amount of good Muslims who pose no threat to me or liberalism or secularism and their friends and people I know and yada yada yada. So I'm very careful about my language, and I've got no tolerance for anti-Muslim bigotry, really.
Good. Yeah, that's good.
But just having, knowing that I'd be speaking to you, I thought that if anyone could understandably harbour some anti-Muslim sentiment, it would be somebody who'd had your experience. I mean, I wouldn't say it was you'd be right, but I'd find it more understandable than everyone else. So, I mean, maybe you can talk a little bit how you've managed to stay so level-headed on this issue, given what you've been through.
Well, a lot of reading and watching YouTube videos online, like Ayan Hishiali and Majid Nawaz and other speakers who are very fair in the way that they represent Muslims. So that has helped, but also just having lots of Muslim friends anyway through my university courses and people that I know and speak to. I've worked very hard on not hating all Muslims and not hating my perpetrators. And even when I was being tortured in the room that I was being tortured in, I prayed, "Dear God, please help me to forgive them, because I don't want my heart to be full of hate." So I've been able to use forgiveness as a way to recover, I suppose, and move on with my life and not hold that grudge and not to hate anybody. And the way that I think about religion is that there's a spectrum of religious beliefs, from really helpful, like giving to the poor and helping the sick and taking care of your children and being a good person, to a really harmful end of the spectrum, which is using religion to abuse people, to exploit people, to take money off people, and all the other terrible things that religion does. So I think of it as like a spectrum, and that faith groups are somewhere along that spectrum, so they can be more towards the really good, kind, helpful, useful faith end, where they are allowing people to heal and get through difficult times, or they can be towards a really harmful end, where they're actually causing a lot more harm and causing division and anger and violence and all the bad things. So that's my perspective on faith.
I kind of agree. I think that the further you get away from a literal conservative interpretation of religious scripts, the better off you are as an individual. And I think the more society moves away from that very simplistic literal interpretation, the more freedom and liberalism we see in that society in general, especially for women and non-believers, baby-eating atheists like myself.
Certainly.
So it's amazing you could find strength in that then. I mean, that's quite remarkable, really, that you're going through this horrible ordeal, to put it as mildly as I can, and the emphasis is very much on religion. These people are invoking a religion, invoking God, but
yes, they were.
At no point this shook your own faith in God.
Not at all. No, not at all. It definitely confused things because I was still very young. I didn't have a full understanding of what Christianity is, and so I didn't quite understand where Islam fit into that or was counter to that. So, for example, I was told, the Quran says, if you don't scream when you're raped, then you're consenting to the rape, so you should be stoned to death.
Wow.
So I was like, well, does that mean I scream? Does that mean I don't scream? I don't understand. I'm confused. Should I believe this? Am I being disrespectful by saying, well, I don't believe that? Whether you can't challenge it. The thing with high control groups is you're not allowed to challenge their authority. You're not allowed to challenge this religious statement. You're not allowed to say, that's not true or that's wrong. Because if you argue with them, they think you're arguing with God, which is the worst thing possible that you could do. So it was very confusing. And then the 4 witnesses as well. It's like, well, there's no point in going to police to report being raped. They'd say, we've raped you. That's their own words. They use the word, not me. So they say, we raped you, but there's no point in going to police to report it because you haven't got 4 witnesses.
So it wasn't a case of they was justifying what they were doing as not a form of rape. They were fully aware and cognizant of the fact that what they were doing was illegal, was rape, but their argument was, under Sharia sort of conditions.
They never mentioned the word Sharia, but it was very much, well, you've brought this on yourself, you deserve it because you've not obeyed God, because you're disobeying Allah, because you're deliberately refusing to be a good Muslim girl. And so, of course, then you think, well, maybe if I convert to Islam, maybe if I wear the hijab, maybe they didn't call it hijab back then, they called it headscarf. So maybe if I wear a headscarf, then maybe they will stop raping me. So I did. I bought a headscarf and started wearing it, thinking maybe this is, if I cover, if I'm modest, if I, stick to all the rules, maybe then they won't beat me. But I was just told to get it off. They just said, you're insulting us by wearing that, get that off. And they raped me again.
I mean, I'm just wondering how much of this as well may be the experience of young Muslim girls up and down the country where it's not revealed at all. It's not something that's been broke or come out. I mean, this seems such... I mean, I know that you said the component of it was this was a very anti-white, very anti,
yes.
kafir kind of outlook. But I'm just wondering, I mean, this is a mentality from these men.
Part of the mentality is, well, I was taught if one of our girls, our Muslim girls, if one of our girls is a coconut, then we gang rape her too.
Right, so just for my listeners, coconut would be like a racial slur, meaning brown on the outside, white on the inside, typically used to denote somebody who's non-white but holds what is considered stereotypical white attitudes and views. I suppose in this case, a Western outlook.
A Western outlook. If she does anything Western, so if she dresses Western or listens to Western music or wears Western makeup or jewellery, or it could be anything that they perceived to be Western, then she'll get the treatment of a Western girl.
And did these men not listen to music at all, or do things? No,
and didn't drink unless they were like just about to gang rape you, and then they get drunk with cans of beer.
And how would they justify the use of alcohol then, or wouldn't they?
Well, I think they would say, yeah, it's a sin, but I'm not a very good Muslim.
Right.
Something like that, some excuse like that, which is, we're all sinners, we've all done wrong.
Bit of cherry picking.
Yeah. I just think it's drinking alcohol is normalised everywhere. I mean, they would wear Western clothes, they'd wear like suits, they'd wear jeans and t-shirts. Some of them would wear traditional clothes, like the older guys would wear the salwar kameez, the long white shirt and I call them ugly shoes. The leather, like slip-on slipper things. Oh, horrible. But yeah, there's a mixture of like being British, Pakistani, and then being traditional Pakistani.
I love how well together you've kept yourself today and how eloquently you've spoke and got your points across really well. And the only source of revulsion I could hear in your voice was when you were describing them shoes.
Oh, they're horrible. Yeah, there are times when you're very disgusted, and you get that again. Like you'll get that gut reaction if you see something that reminds you of a certain thing that has happened. You just feel disgusted.
Yeah.
The smell, curry smell on a man is just like, it makes you want to vomit.
Right. No, I understand totally. You wanted to spend a bit of time talking about some more, some broader systemic issues, didn't you, in regards to education and things like that?
Well, yeah. Well, I mean, the reason I talk about grooming gang ideology is because it's something that we can counter through education, and it's something that needs to be recognised in legislation so that we can not only prevent it, but we can protect girls properly in the right way with specialist teams, because it's not the same as other types of sexual abuse. These gangs are very, very organised, and it's a very different type. Yeah,
I mean, I was discussing this on another podcast with my co-host a while back, and I was saying to her that, I mean, I was trying to be positive, and I the only thing I could really come up with on this topic was the fact that it'd be a lot harder to dismiss someone's claims now. It'd almost be suicide for a legal body or a police or a law enforcement agent or anybody or a social worker for that matter to dismiss claims of child exploitation and grooming because of how big it's blown up. Am I wrong? So I've got nothing positive, basically.
Wrong. I think there's lots of different police forces in the UK. You tend to think it's just one big organisation, but it isn't. There's lots of different ones.
Yeah.
And some of them are really hot and they're really good at it. And they, like, for example, there was a case recently in Glasgow in Scotland. And I think there was a lot of perpetrators that they arrested, like 50 odd perpetrators that they arrested. although just arresting them doesn't mean anything, they've got to actually charge them and then take them through court and do all that. They've got to build a good case. But there are other police forces who are still turning a blind eye. They're still disrespecting victims. They're still turning you away. They're still absolutely refusing to talk about race and religion. They refuse to even look for evidence that it's racially or religiously aggravated.
So what do you think's what's in it for them to do that? Are we still living under the shadow of the fear of being accused of racism? Is it a case of a lot of the girls involved are from vulnerable backgrounds, broken homes, addicted to drugs, been involved in prostitution in a way, so the police are kind of look down on them in that sense and don't think they deserve the full...
bigotry of low expectations about white girls
right
within the police force. But it's complicated. There probably is a fear of racism. There's a lack of awareness of the fact that it is racist abuse that they're actually having reported to them. They may be bribed, they may be corrupt, they may lack intelligence.
Right.
they maybe just lack the skill. They're just not skilled enough to do it.
Isn't there a bit of an issue in society, in our ultra-liberal society that we have now, this progressive notion that it's not actually possible to be racist against a white person? I think that idea seems to carry a lot of weight, especially in our institutions, especially academically, especially in the middle classes.
Definitely, but even on the right, I see people talking around this issue, and they've got no clue. They've got no clue, or if they have got a slight clue, they're afraid to say it. And so that's why I kind of speak out on behalf of survivors, because we know that it's racism. We do now. Maybe at the time when it's happening, we didn't realise that actually this is racist abuse. But now I think there's greater awareness about it, and we do understand what we've experienced is identity attacks, and there's a reason why that is given an uplift in sentencing for racially driven attacks, because it does attack your core person, and that takes longer to recover from. A lot of the research that's gone into recovering from identity-based violence shows that it has a more profound impact on people. It's like your spirit is assaulted, not just your body, your mind. Sexually, you're assaulted. Your whole deep spirit is assaulted, and that's like you get with spiritual abuse, like through the use of religion and invoking God's word, and that God is putting this on you in their mind. So it disrupts your relationship with God as well.
I'm always interested in hearing from people who have been through a bad experience and managed to escape it, which is always the best part of the story for me. But then I'm always fascinated to hear how they then make that decision to not only be able to move on in a sense and start life themselves, but not only that, speak out, be a public advocate against this sort of thing, speak up to raise awareness, reach out to others. And I'm just wondering because there's many people who unfortunately have had a similar experience to you, but would have quite understandably thought, well, I want to draw a line across that now and never have to acknowledge it or talk about it to other people again. Yeah. And you've gone the other way, which is a very courageous decision to be vocal about. And I'm just wondering what's the change that occurs in you to inspire you to do something like that?
I just think it's the right thing to do.
Great answer.
Yeah, it's just the right thing to do. I'm not making any money out of it. I'm not paid for it. I'm not affiliated with any organisation. I'm just me speaking as much as I can. I've knocked on doors and the doors have opened. I sent an email to number 10 to say, can I come and talk to you about it? And they accepted, and I gave them 2 hours explaining the whole grooming gang ideology and asking for changes in the law, changes in legislation.
Oh, who did you speak to?
Who did I speak to? The Special Secretary to Theresa May.
Oh, great.
That was a year ago. And I went at the same time to the Home Office, so I went to them and talked to them about it there. But unfortunately, these organisations, they do have big far left, average left lobbying groups, and they do have the Islamic lobbying groups who are pushing against what I'm saying. They don't want what I'm saying
Yeah.
and what I'm asking for. They don't want anti-Western hate crime to be given the same status as anti-Muslim hate crime or anti-Semitic hate crime, even though those are the three main Abrahamic religions, the Christianity, Judaism and Islam. But I think when it comes to our laws relating to relationships, they are the best in the world. I think our marriage laws are good. They protect people who get divorced. They, allow a fair distribution of resources in a family when things don't work out. I think monogamy is the best thing for children, the best thing for families. Unless you're a multi-millionaire, it's very hard to provide for and support one wife and keep her happy, never mind 2 or 3 or 4 wives. So these are things that need to be talked about in school, and the healthy relationships education about consent that's going on in schools is really positive and really helpful, and that counters the whole, you're allowed to have sex with a girl once she started her periods narrative. That if you can teach young people that, if a boy gets a girl pregnant and she's 12, then she's more likely to die, the baby's more likely to die in pregnancy and birth. There's practical reasons, physiological reasons why it's just better to wait until you're 16. Mentally you're not old enough.
Yeah.
Under the age of 16. So, there's lots of ways that we can educate people, and things are, being accepted in many, many different Muslim communities all over the world, through the influence of just common sense and scientific advancements, and research into what works with relationships as well. So there's all that. But according to legislation, I think there's quite a lot of loopholes that at the moment, especially with hate crime laws, there's the imam registration laws where people are not being checked. They're being brought in from overseas. They've never been educated in Europe. They don't understand a lot of things I've just talked about. So a lot of these imams are teaching quite extreme and severe versions of Islam that feeds into the grooming gang ideology and the harm and the anti-Western mentality and the propaganda.
Yeah, there doesn't seem an even or equal appetite in terms of going for hate speech and things like that to address the things that are said up and down our country in mosques. And I've noticed that certain Western rappers will be put on the no entry list to the UK because of some of their more colourful lyrics. Yet imams from Pakistan who literally advocate death for blasphemy, and when they get it, celebrate it in the streets in Pakistan, and then have the red carpet rolled out for them in places like Oldham and Rochdale when they go to mosques. And
exactly.
That's definitely a concern.
There are links to terrorist groups in Pakistan, in the Middle East and in Syria that are linked to the UK, and a lot of it I think could be funded through trafficking, through just selling one girl. They can make £1,000 a night, so over many months they can make a huge amount of money, and they're pumping that back into drugs trade, into arms trade, ignoring it and not dealing with it, and ignoring the fact that there are these links to terrorism, links to religious extremism. It's a very, very big mistake to just ignore it and think it'll go away. It definitely won't, and it does have impacts around the world.
Was there anything else that you were really keen to get across as well?
There's lots of little details about all the different legislation that I'm talking to various lawyers about, and I'm aiming to get some proposals before government with counter-extremism experts, with civil servants, with MPs.
And this is about recognising the kind of anti-white aspects and the sort of racial hatred that occurs as well.
Yeah, I would call it the anti-Western and religious extremism aspects.
Right.
And just to get all the legislation linking together so that the counter-terrorism legislation links in with the hate crime legislation. At the moment, we have last year in the CPS hate crime report, we had 11 prosecutions for stirring up hatred, and nearly all of them, 9 out of the 11, was for stirring up hatred by so-called far-right groups, and the other 2 were anti-Semitic. So there was not a single prosecution for stirring up hatred against the West.
And you think that's prominent enough that were people taking that seriously, it would definitely rank somewhere highly in them statistics?
Well, it should be given equal, if not higher, precedent, seeing as we are the West. Hopefully, we are protecting ourselves. It should be given a major, serious look and a view. For online hate preachers or social media hate preachers, they should have as harsh a punishment as someone who misgenders somebody or calls trans man a woman or something like that. So that's what I'm pushing for, and what I'm asking for is, please follow me, please support me, retweet some of my tweets. Doors are opening. I'm, going off to London and meeting different people, going off to military centres and meeting different people, hopefully next year or over the next year. So that's what I'm doing, and the more support that I have, that'll be really great.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you're really easy to listen to, and what you've got to say is very interesting. You do seem very level-headed about it. I'm not sure I'm entirely on board with any new sort of speech codes, but I'm definitely interested in what you're putting forward, and I certainly do think there's something to this idea of anti-Western hate and certainly an anti-white outlook on some of these groups that really does need, at the bare minimum, acknowledging by the authorities and the wider general public. But people can find you on Twitter at Ella Hill UK. That's right, isn't it?
Yes, that's right. Yes, yeah.
Excellent. Well,
yeah, there's a lot more to talk about when you talk about hate crimes, because there's 2 types of hate crimes. There's a non-crime hate crime, which of course should be scrapped.
Yeah.
And there's a crime hate crime, which is a racially and religiously aggravated crime, which I think should be applied fairly. If it's being applied to people who pull up someone's hijab or punch someone for being Muslim, then it should be applied the other way around to Muslims who punch a white person as well.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, if you want to touch on that, I'm more than happy to take some time to do it. I think one of the issues we have here is that the police have got this recent emphasis on recording non-crime incidents or the hate incidents, they'll sometimes call them, which are not necessarily crimes that go to convictions and prosecutions. But if somebody says they're a victim of a hate crime, it gets logged as such regardless of the truth of the details. And when you see these statistics about a massive increase in hate crime or hate incident, a lot of the time, which, obviously physical assaults do happen, but thankfully they're quite rare. Luckily, anti-Muslim violent attacks are quite rare. But when we boil these statistics down, a lot of the time it's just rude comments, many of which are online. And I mean, when I say just rude comments, I mean, I don't want to play down anti-Muslim verbal abuse, but I think we're given a false picture of how these attacks, the quote-unquote attacks, manifest by inflated statistics in the press. I don't know if you know more about that than I do.
Well, I've read the CPS hate crime report for 2018 to 2019, and there's a lot more of a breakdown of what these crimes are and the convictions for them. So they would say that in that year, 58% of perpetrators were white, 6% of perpetrators were black, and 5% of perpetrators were Asian. But they didn't record the ethnicities because they didn't have enough. The data was incomplete from the police. So we don't know what the victims' ethnicities were.
Right, okay, the victims.
Yeah, there was no victims' ethnicities because the police were not recording it properly. So it's very hard to interpret a lot of these statistics. But on that report, it showed that 0.2% of the convictions for hate crime were sexual offences. So a very tiny amount of sexual offences are being reported as hate crimes. And there are ways to increase that amount that is being recorded. If you do a very small change in some of the legislation on the Sexual Offences Act 2003, then that should say that you can allow for religiously and racially aggravated sexual offences to be recorded and to be prosecuted as such. And there should be another amendment to that, which says that you exclude the admissibility of any theological defence to sex crimes or any excuse. So, for example, you'll get some Muslims who'll say, well, I've just come to the UK. I didn't know it was illegal in my country. We're allowed to have sex with 13-year-olds. And so that has been accepted as a defence argument. But if it's written into the legislation that that will not be accepted, then eventually it will filter down that you can't use that as an excuse or to get your sentence reduced.
Okay, Ella, well, I pretty much ticked off everything I wanted to speak about. But if there's anything in particular that you wanted to say before you got back to your evening, I know you've got a night of packing ahead for a planned holiday. Is there anything else you wanted to touch on or get across before I let you get back to your evening?
No, I can't think of anything specific right now. But it's been lovely chatting with you, and I look forward to hearing more of your podcasts in the future.
Oh, thank you. Well, it's been entirely my pleasure. I'm grateful for you coming on and speaking so candidly and eloquently about it. I'm really glad that you have made the decision to publicly speak out about it, because I feel like you're a sensible voice and very clear speaker as well, which is always helpful.
Well, it's my pleasure. Great to talk to you.
You too, and we should definitely do this another time when we've got a bit more to talk about as well, because I'm sure you'll be making progress on that and have new things to share going forward as well.
Yeah, I'm happy to speak to anybody. If anyone wants to contact me and have a chat, then I'm very happy to do that. If we can help each other, that'd be good. From whatever community, whatever background, we can all share ideas and suggestions. That's great.
Wonderful. Ella, thank you very much again.
You're welcome. Take care then.
Thank you for listening to the Godless Spellchecker podcast. The podcast is a one-man operation produced in my spare time away from my day job, and I love making it for you. If you enjoy what you hear, please consider lending some support. The show is entirely listener supported. I don't sell anything, I don't run ads, and given the alternative and unpopular focus of my content, it's very unlikely to find a sponsor. So there are a number of ways you can support and chip in and help improve the show and give me more time to produce more content. You can become a patron supporter and pledge a monetary amount per month or per episode by visiting patreon.com/gspellchecker. If you can't lend monetary support right now, don't worry, there's other ways you can help the podcast too. You can share it on your various social media networks, or take a moment to leave a review wherever you listen to it. Your support is massively appreciated. Thank you. Think we've all learned something here today?